Aaron Renn here. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Philip Howard. He is the founder and chair of Common Good and a senior counsel at Covington and Burling. If you're not familiar with Common Good, you should familiarize yourself with them. They're a great nonpartisan nonprofit whose mission is to restore the freedom of officials and citizens to use common sense, which I love. They're at commongood.org, and there's a link to that in the show notes. And he also just wrote a paper for the Manhattan Institute called Escape from Quicksand, a new framework for modernizing America. Again, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And he was gracious enough to come on the show today to discuss it. So, Mr. Howard, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you, Aaron. Been a big fan.
So, again, I've enjoyed your work for several years since I was at the Manhattan Institute, and you wrote an incredible paper called 2 Years, Not 10 Years, about the fact that it takes 10 years just to even start on our public works projects, maybe even longer for some of them. We need to get that down. You've been a leader in trying to restore a more rational approach to getting things to public works. And I think you've really kind of put your finger on some of the underlying issues. And I think at some level, people know we're mired in red tape, but I'm not sure they really understand how serious the problem is. And so you lead off by talking about this $42.5 billion federal appropriation in 2021 to provide broadband to underserved areas, which has deployed no service in 4 years, accomplished nothing. And you would think that would be easy.
Right.
Similarly, we spent 7.5 billion or allocated 7.5 billion to build a national charger network in 2021, and we've got 11 grand total, 11 chargers.
Oh, I think it's up
Uh,
to 50 now.
Fifth, oh, okay. Well,
after,
we
after
made
4 years, right?
after 4 years and billions of dollars.
Right.
Um, can you help people understand the basic problem we're facing?
Yes, and I think it's an important conversation because the left has come around to saying we've got too much process with books like Abundance and such, but they're not. They don't have solutions, and they're not looking at the kind of root causes here. What's happened is that we've created a governing structure that's based on compliance rather than responsibility, so that we tell officials they have to comply with law. And so the people who are in charge of providing broadband to underserved communities look at the law, which federal law alone is about 150 million words of binding federal law and regulation, and they start complying, and they comply with getting Native American tribes to comment on any project that any Native American ever lived in, which is all over the country, and you try to figure out how you're going to give some contracts to women and minority-owned businesses, and you have someone else, you hire consultants to think about where exactly should the cable be dug, as if that's a major disruption, which is really not. Um, and and then somebody decides that they don't like the project or they don't like where it's going, so they hire lawyers and they have an objection, and they come up with objections of one sort or another, and then you have to respond to the objections, and it just goes on forever. It's like a hamster on a wheel in a cage. I mean, it's just that's what modern government is.
Yeah, I don't think we know like what a functional government would look like. You contrast today's system with the New Deal, and you mentioned that in November 1933, FDR created the Civil Works Administration, and 2 months later, 2 million people were already employed. Like that doesn't even seem physically possible, and yet we. Yeah, I mean, I think about too, like about World War II. You know how we changed factories over to start building planes and ships and all that, and like the whole war was only like 4 years. I mean, we not only pivoted on a dime and did all this stuff and like won the entire war before we would even press the go button today. And then when we initially passed some of these laws, like NEPA, which requires environmental impact statements, initially they were very, very short, like 12 pages or something like that. How did this these did it happen that we developed all this
Yeah, yeah,
process?
nothing. Yeah, you know, I've had one policy idea in my life that means anything, and I've managed to parlay it into 7 books. And the one idea is that only humans make things happen.
Mm,
You can't create a system of government that's better than people, or a system of justice that's better than people. And life's just too complex. Michael Polanyi, a famous philosopher, said life is like a kaleidoscope and never repeats any
mm,
exact pattern or situation. And so, we created this system. Really, it was a legal experiment after the 60s to try to guarantee that there were no bad choices and no more Robert Moseses, building highways through the slums or whatever. And instead of doing it the way the framers would have suggested, which is okay, have checks and balances, have the decisions be approved by someone else.
mm-hmm.
They created this legal compliance model where it's all about following the legal labyrinth, but the legal labyrinth never ends. I mean, there's how do you decide how much is in an environmental review statement? I mean, there was one project that I wrote about where they were going to raise the roadway of the Bayonne Bridge to accommodate a new generation of ships into Newark Harbor. And the project it was brilliant. It was the idea of a public servant. Instead of building a new tunnel or whatever, they just raised the roadway of the existing 100-year-old bridge on the same foundations. It cost 1/3 as much, no environmental impact and such. Under the rules, they had to do a study of all historic buildings within a 2-mile radius, even though it was touching no buildings. It was the same right of way. There was the same bridge that was before. They had to notify all the Native American tribes that might have once lived in the area to get them involved, even though they weren't disturbing any grounds of any sort, because the bridge and the highway were already there. And you sort of there's all these processes that made no sense whatsoever. And then the way the process works is because you're trying to avoid human judgment. Nobody can decide anything. So you have to do a study of historic buildings. Well, how do you hire the consultant to do the study? Well, that itself requires a process.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody has to design the process to hire the consultant to do the study of the historic building. And so the thing just stretches out forever.
Yeah, I think you said that environmental assessment was 20,000 pages, literally just to raise the road a little
Right.
bit. They're not digging any new foundations, any new piers, any new
Right.
anything. And then people still sued over it.
That's right. They sued. But again, the environmental, the people who built the system assume that people sue because somehow their rights have been violated. No, they don't. They sue in order to get a lever to use as a lever to get something else. In this case, the suit was funded by the Teamsters, who wanted to make the port only a union shop, so no more independent truckers.
Hmm.
And so they were making these bogus claims through a bogus environmental group in order to try to get the Port Authority to settle the lawsuit by making the port a closed shop.
Hmm. So in other words, they're just trying to get, we're going to hold your project up if you don't give us what we want, basically. Trying to,
Welcome to America.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's hardly any project. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen the act of extortion going on by all sorts of groups, environmental groups and others, and local governments saying they want money for CSX to expand the railroad under the city of Washington, even though it affects the community not at all. They still have to get approval, and so if you want approval, I mean, we might as well have highwaymen on the roads,
Right.
collecting money to go by. This legal system is not a fair legal system. It's designed by By designing it to be free of human judgment, we've made it a tool for extortion.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that there's nobody in charge of like really making a decision on any of these matters. So there's like one group that does the historic reviews, another department that does floodplains, another department that does, American Indian tribes. And it's not like the White House can come in and arbitrate all these things and decide what to do. It's like there's all these different people who are doing their silos, and they're all. It's like there's nobody making a decision.
Right. So there's no there. So, uh, I tell the story in the paper that I was summoned to the Council of Environmental Quality at the White House. That they were going to convince me what a good job they had done. They'd created a 16-member permitting council, and they had computer dashboards to show exactly where in the process everything was. And they went on for 45 minutes explaining to me how this thing worked, which I didn't understand at all. By then I said, well, just in case someone disagrees, out of the 16 members with what you're doing, who has authority to make a decision? And the answer to that was nobody. That would be too dangerous. So what does that mean? That means that whichever agency cares enough to game the system to just get their way. And by the way, environmental, like infrastructure projects, always have a harmful environmental impact. There's not one project that doesn't in some way affect, you put a wind farm up and it disturbs the views or gets in the way of birds or whatever. You put power lines in. People don't like to be near high transmission power lines. I get that. Um, Probably the route of the power line will go over some wetlands or pristine forests or such. So approving infrastructure requires trade-off judgments. And so the question is, are the benefits of the infrastructure getting, say, renewable energy from the Midwest to Chicago? Is that worth the fact that the line is cutting through the pristine forest? Well, if you can't make that judgment, then nothing happens. And, and it probably is worth going through the pristine forest, but no one has authority to do that. So,
Right.
so it costs twice as much. And I mean, what's so ironic, of course, is that the people who defend this system, who use it as a kind of a lever for power, do so from the comfort of an economy that exists on infrastructure that they would never allow to be built. So, what are the odds that a transcontinental railroad would be allowed to be built over the Rocky Mountains?
Well, I'm
The
not going to do
odds,
that.
the odds are zero. And yet this economy wouldn't work without those rail lines.
Yeah, we're lucky we built so much in the past um, there that we don't have it. And you're right about the. I think you say in the report that the cost of all this red tape doubles or triples the price of everything that we do.
Yeah, and it's harmful to the environment because it
Yeah.
it it it, it prolongs all these bottlenecks. I mean, there's this new railway tunnel that's being built under the Hudson River that I got involved in to try to expedite permitting on, and it's absolutely vital to transportation in the Northeast region, which is currently served by two tunnels, which are 120 years old, are decrepit and need to be rebuilt almost completely, result in enormous delays costing billions of dollars every year. And the new tunnels at this point finally got approved. Uh, they're likely to be completed 30 some years after the proposal was made.
Wow.
3 decades.
It's a lot of inflation right there.
Yeah, it's a lot of inflation. And by the way, the process itself, the overhead of the offices and the architects and the lawyers and all that kind of stuff, that itself doubles the cost.
You mentioned the book Abundance, and one of the things that I've noticed is there seems to be a growing sense across the political spectrum that our inability to build things is becoming a problem. Some of it could be like shipbuilding, for the military or different things of that nature, or being able to supply green power or build powers to fund AI data centers or whatever. But as you point out, like there aren't a lot of highly developed solutions for this. What is your solution to our problem?
Well, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. The solution is that you have to remake this quicksand of law, this 150 million words, into a framework of authority where the authority to make trade-off judgments and such of officials is defined within a legal framework, and that can be checked by courts or whatever. But it's built around the authority of officials to actually use their judgment, not simply to do rote compliance. Because compliance leads us nowhere. It just leads us in an instance, in a kind of like a Moebius strip. You just go around the circle over and over again. So you have to actually rebuild the governing system to give people the authority to make judgments. And we don't trust them, fine. You can have somebody else have the authority to reverse the judgment. The thing you can't do is have a system without human judgment. And we've created an enormous legal system, all built since the 1960s, all as a result of the collective guilt we felt after the 1960s, explicitly designed to prevent human judgment. I mean, the historian Eric Foner wrote a book basically saying that redefined freedom as the rejection of all authority. Well, if nobody's in charge, nothing gets done.
Right.
And
Yeah. So you call, among other things, for restating all these compliance rules as sort of policy goals, and the idea being transparency, so people see what's going on, but not attempting to second guess decision makers.
right. So, well, first of all, I'm not even against second guessing decision makers. What I'm against is making them prove their decisions as a matter of legal compliance or objective proof. You can't prove that the power line is worth cutting through the pristine forest. That's a judgment. It's a political choice. It ought to be politically accountable. If we don't trust the people in charge, you can put an independent, I wouldn't give it this role, but I recommend creating a national infrastructure board just to be a kind of a moral authority that can maintain a list of priorities for the country and oversee approval processes and call them out when they're taking too long, and oversee contracting to call them out when they're giving away all the money to feather bedding, by unions and such. So I think there's a role for new institutions, but ultimately some official has to be in charge of making a judgment. And if the officials disagree, some other official has the authority to resolve that disagreement. I mean, going back to the New Deal, Harry Hopkins, so Civil Works Administration was created in November of 1933. Harry Hopkins, who worked for FDR, sent out a telegram to mayors and governors saying we're going to try to hire several million people, and we're looking for projects, good civic projects and infrastructure projects. And so, if you're interested, come to Washington next week with your projects. So all these people show up, they spend a week, they talk to Harry Hopkins, they have these proposals, and just a few pages each, there's no time. One day, Harry Hopkins sat down with proposals. He approved 109 proposals. The next day, he sat down, he approved 121 proposals. The next day, he sent 136 proposals. The money just went out. They went to that's their job. It went out to the mayors and governors. Here's the federal money, build it. with no process, no compliance. No. They sent out auditors though to make sure the money, make sure the money wasn't poorly spent. Turns out there was almost no fraud. In 4 months they built 250,000 miles of road. Miles and miles of sewer, water mains, all that kind of stuff. Uh, Literally, at the end of 4 months, they'd done all that. They'd already done it. They'd only hired the people. They'd done it. So people have to. The whole idea of responsibility. This is the key American concept, right? Is that people roll up their sleeves and get things done. Well, if you go through the day worrying about whether you've complied with everything, or whether what you're saying is offending someone, or what preferred pronoun they use, or or whether you've consulted with the Native American tribes, pretty soon you're paralyzed.
How do we actually implement this? Because when I look at the politics, I mean, even the abundance guys complain about this. If you look at the Democratic Party, the sort of post-mortem on some of these things around broadband and charging stations and even the CHIPS Act is what they call the everything bagel approach. The
Right.
left wants to make sure that you have minority hiring set-asides and women set-asides and all this stuff to make sure we're using the right levels of green energy and that we're recycling all the construction. So they want to impose all of these things. And I think on the conservative side, they sort of are invested in the system not working
Right.
in a sense. They don't want government to be able to do
Right.
anything officially. So how would we actually politically bring a system like this into being?
Well, first of all, the last point is a really important point. Both both sides have an interest in the system working the way it does. The progressives get all their money from the groups that prevent things from being efficient, the environmental groups, the public unions, all that kind of stuff. And as long as there's someone like Trump around, all those groups will pour lots of money into the Democratic coffers, right? I mean, it's, running against Trump. Trump runs against the failure of government. Doge has no vision to make government work better the day after Doge. It's just about cutting stuff. It's just a kind of a indiscriminate form of deregulation, really. Let's fire all these people or cut all these people, and who knows what their idea is. But it isn't, let's make government work better. So they're scratching the itch of, we hate Big Brother, government doesn't work well, which is true. And so so neither side has an interest in doing it. So there needs to be a movement. I'm talking to a lot of people about trying to figure out what that looks like and what the word is. It's not abundance. I mean, abundance, it's like saying you're for happiness. Yes, I'm for happiness. I want everybody to be happy, or abundant and have lots of two chickens in every pot. I think it's more about human initiative. I think it's about human re-empowerment. It's about restoring morality and common sense to people in their daily lives. And by doing that, maybe they'll be willing to let officials restore common sense in their lives, as long as they're accountable. So I think I think the only model that ever worked in America is a human responsibility model. And that means people have to have the authority to make choices and to be accountable for other people for how they did their choices. In infrastructure, I think there needs to be a recodification commission. Congress can never do this. It's like violates the laws of legislative physics to to sit down and negotiate in a back room with all these different interest groups pulling and tugging and wanting to keep what they have. You have to give it to the equivalent of a base closing commission, a group
Yeah.
of people who don't have an agenda, to come up with a new simplified structure built around the authority to make trade-off judgments. That's what's required to build infrastructure. And getting rid of all those minority set-asides and the rights of this person, that person. You just can't satisfy all those goals. The goal is to build infrastructure, so let's build it. In the meantime, nothing's going to happen unless Congress passes a law, which Joe Manchin was trying to do before he retired. But the law basically would be something like, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary, the way we're going to build transmission lines in this country in the next 5 years will be this. And
Mm-hmm.
you create an authority structure and a check and balance, and it allows the people doing it to ignore the quicksand, because pruning this jungle is absolutely not, which is what I think Ezra Klein, all these abundance guys think they can do. You can't prune the jungle. There's always another rule. I mean, I was testifying before Congress about having page limits on environmental review and time limits, and they enacted them.
Mm-hmm.
And what difference did it make? Nothing, no difference.
Right.
And it made no difference because they're constantly crossing the wires of, have you checked on the historic building, or have you checked on the endangered species, or have you, gone out and talked to the Native Americans? There are all these other laws that conflict with it. So you can't, I mean, we've created this legal system where basically everything's illegal.
Right.
so, so even AI, with all its power, probably couldn't find a path through the current legal
Mm-hmm.
maze to get anything done. So, so you need to sort of create a new simplified framework. You can do it as pilot projects, is fine. Like, and do it for this area. We need shipbuilding. Great. Notwithstanding any other law to the contrary, the way we're going to create shipbuilding facilities is the following.
Yeah. I think as you point out, we haven't physically lost the ability to do things, which I think is an important point. When people look at China, they think, we've lost our mojo. We can't do anything anymore. But as you point out, when we actually run into an emergency situation and need to suspend the rules, we're actually capable of doing things very quickly. You mentioned this I-95 bridge in Pennsylvania. A section collapsed due to a fire, and they reopened it in 12 days. It
Right,
was like
right. It would have taken
boom.
at least a year,
Yeah.
and because they let people, just like Harry Hopkins with FDR, the transportation commissioner says, I think the best right way to do this is, can't put dirt there; it's too heavy. Let's do recycled glass, and then okay, fine, let's go do it. And they make a contract, and then they're waiving permit right, but we're already using this contractor. We kind of like them. Let's let them do it. Fine. You don't have to go through all the bidding for the procurement. And then the final day came. This is the part I like best. And it rained, and they weren't going to be able to open it because it wasn't going to dry or whatever. The new asphalt because of the
Mhm.
rain. So somebody said, well, the Pocono Raceway has these road dryers they use when they have rain and they're doing races. Maybe we could use those. So Pocono Raceway donated their dryer
Mhm.
for use. So they got the dryer down there for the Pocono Raceway, dried it out and opened it, in 12 days. So, it's like Americans rolling up their sleeves. That's what we do.
Yeah. I think the other example, you didn't mention this, and it's controversial in some circles, I realize, was Operation Warp Speed that created these COVID vaccines in less than a year. I mean,
Yeah,
like,
fantastic.
it's like, wow, we actually have the ability to do things. We just need to change them. The one, go ahead. I was just going to say, one thing you highlight that really is something I think about a lot is the role of the judiciary in all of this. Because when they passed the NEPA Act, originally, they didn't say anything about judicial review, but judges basically rapidly gave themselves the authority to say, well, we can say you didn't do this, you didn't do that, and essentially averting litigation now drives almost everything there. And my view has been that there's been a sort of metastasization of judicial power
Right.
everywhere in the Western world, in which judges just have seized control of more and more and more. of our system. How do we reform the system such that no matter what you do, it just doesn't turn into the same thing again after 3, 4, or 5 federal cases?
Yeah. Really, really, a really important point. I mean, one of the reasons that environmental reviews have become thousands of pages, sort of this process of no pebble left unturned, right, is that instead of, first of all, it doesn't enhance transparency, it obscures it because the important points are hidden in the thousands of pages, right? So it'd be much better to have 12 pages. But the reason it's there is because the objectors to environmental review kept, and the courts went along with this, kept saying, well, but you didn't study the effects on the larvae of the snail darter or whatever.
Yeah.
And so uh, in a sensible system of law, the executive branch has authority to manage government, and the law sets a framework for their authority. The role of courts should be only to decide if an official transgresses those boundaries of their authority, not to second guess the decision. They violated the law, or they weren't supposed to be deciding about, navigable rivers or something. It wasn't their
Hmm.
job. But instead, courts view their job today as being kind of super bureaucrats, where they, under the guise of looking at legal analysis, in effect, substitute their judgment for that of the official. Well, that's not their job. They're not politically accountable. It's not their job. So, so the limits on judicial review need to be clear, but they can't be clear in a system that's based just on compliance, because there's always some non-compliant. You can't comply with it all. So you need to have an authority framework and say your only job is to decide if the official violated, transgressed their authority. Then it becomes clear.
Yeah, I've noticed that some of the times when we do things, they'll cut one of these deals in Congress and they will, exempt a pipeline from judicial review or something like that, and then it just sails right through. I know we've done it one-offs on occasion, but
No, it's the only way anything gets done. It's
yeah,
called categorical exclusions.
yeah,
And so what the Manchin-Barrasso bill that was floated last year did was basically make transmission lines and a bunch of other categories into categorical exclusions. So there's no review at all.
yeah.
So the irony of this too much review is you end up getting no review.
I have to tell you, back in the 90s and 2000s, I used to enjoy reading environmental impact statements for highways. And they were long even then, but they were maybe this thick,
Two
300
inches, you're
pages.
saying, yeah.
And now what I have found is even I can't read them. I mean, they're so long, no human being is actually capable of even understanding what's in the thing, I guess, unless you're the lawyers that were hired for tons of money to do that.
You're making a bigger point, which is that law only has a characteristic of law if it's coherent to the people who are expected to abide by it. So a disclosure document that's so technical and filled with so much detail that no community person could understand it might as well be no disclosure at all. Law that's so dense and so specific that the people expected to abide by it can't know it or internalize it is a form of tyranny. It's arbitrary. I mean, there have been studies of like nursing home regulation where they found that even the inspectors didn't know most of the law. There's so many rules, like 1,000 pages of rules and such. So they
Makes me
just,
think of Harvey Silverglate's 3 felonies a day. That the
yeah,
average American
exactly.
makes
It's
three
like,
felonies a day.
and by the way, the conservatives were part of the problem here. They wanted,
Yeah.
quote, clear law. We don't want
Mm,
any officials to have any authority. Just make law clear. Well, just make law clear ends up with 150 million words of detail that no one can know.
right.
So we're drowning in this stuff, and we can't. I think the point that the people have to come to grips with, we can't repair the system. We have to replace it with one grounded in human responsibility. That's the framework of the Constitution. That's how the rule of law works, and it's how human nature works. So, we're overdue for um, a decade of recodification commissions, simplifying everything so that schools can work, so that we can build the infrastructure, so that we can get rid of red tape in healthcare that wastes over $1 million per doctor every year. $15,000 per American family goes to administration and healthcare. Think about that. I mean,
Wow.
it's literally like it's a form of mental illness that what we've created. So here we're facing with a world where the autocrats are do whatever they want and they're threatening us right and left, and we've got this paralyzed country where Americans are not allowed to make things work anymore. Well, we've got to replace that system. I have a I have a book of essays coming out in the fall, um, of which the lead essay, which is on American initiative, about the subtitle is an intervention to recover America's can-do spirit. Basically says all the assumptions underlying this current legal system are false. It is false that correct choices should be objectively provable. Subjectivity is not the enemy of freedom, it's the essence of freedom. What you believe is right and true and stuff is who you are, and you should be able to act that way and stand up for it. And morality, we have no morality if we can't judge people by their character. And yet we're told, who are you to judge? It's just the way I am. I'm a thief or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm a bad person. So we have, these accepted wisdoms that prop up this quicksand of law that mixing metaphors here, um, that we just have to abandon, and we have to acknowledge that we can't fix this. We need to replace it so that the schools will work.
No, well, I agree. Certainly, something like what you are suggesting is exactly what we need. And so I think with that, I'll just leave that as our concluding word. My guest today has been Philip Howard of Common Good, and we've been discussing his Manhattan Institute paper, Escape from Quicksand. And you can find a link both to his organization and that paper in the show notes. Mr. Howard, thank you so much for joining.
Great to be with you, Aaron.